Hi again, everybody, and welcome back to Utopia. You know, I keep hearing about Bear's Ears and the attempt to shrink Grand Staircase Escalante, and I understand there seems to be a constant struggle in the West about who owns public lands. The battle over public lands in the American West and in Utah has raged for many years. The disagreements constantly simmer and occasionally boil over, as is the case of Cliven Bundy's armed resistance in Nevada, and when armed militants, led by his son Armand Bundy, took over a wildlife refuge in Oregon. Passions run high on both sides of the issue. Does the federal government own too much land? Could the states manage it better? Who is the better steward? We'll address some of these questions today. Some will have to wait for another day. One thing, though, about public lands, there are so many interesting facets to the story, one episode would not do it justice. So today, as always, we'll talk to the experts about the facts, the legal facts and the historical facts that lay the groundwork for the system that we have here today. Here's Sean King with more.
Confrontation in Nevada this morning threatens to become a modern-day range war.
You're grazing your cows on public land.
Rancher Cliven Bundy says the land that I'm standing on right now has been in his family for generations.
Cliven Bundy.
But Nevada is a sovereign state. The land within here, this state belongs to the state of Nevada, not the United States. And you guys got to understand that.
Grazing cattle on public lands without a permit, on its surface, doesn't seem like it should garner national headlines. However, on March 27, 2014, a Nevada rancher named Cliven Bundy received much more than 15 minutes of fame when he confronted government employees on the federal land near his home in Bunkerville, Nevada.
Bundy had refused to pay his grazing fees. His cows were on federal land, and he was refusing to pay the fees that are the very minimal that you have to pay to have your cows out on federal public land, and had for a number of years, and wasn't following orders from federal courts.
Cliven Bundy blocked the federal officers from moving his cattle. His illegal obstruction immediately escalated when dozens of militants armed with assault rifles and handguns descended upon the scene in a show of force, pressuring government employees to back down. Fortunately, no blood was shed. 2 years later, in 2016, protesting control of federal lands, in this case, the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in Oregon, another armed militia stormed the refuge headquarters. For 41 days, people watched their televisions and checked their news feeds to learn if and how the occupation would end. In this case, blood was shed.
I think the Bundy standoff is just, it's a microcosm of what we see around the West and have seen for generations, that you have a local landowner, local individual who doesn't accept the fact that these are federal lands, and that the federal government has a legitimate claim and is the legitimate owner. I think there has been simmering discontent in the West with the United States and the idea of absentee landowners and federal officials in Washington, D.C. trying to tell local and state officials and individuals how to manage these federal lands. So that's a part of the problem, I think, and that spans back for hundreds of years.
In Utah, 64% of the land is federally owned. There are national parks, national forests, and land managed by the Bureau of Land Management, or BLM. The BLM, which is part of the Department of Interior, manages around 23 million acres in Utah, making the BLM the largest landowner in the state.
So the overwhelming majority of Utah is managed by the federal government, is owned and managed by the federal government. So we like to refer to those as federal public lands that are owned by all Americans, managed on their behalf, on our behalf.
If you've kayaked in the Uinta National Forest, if you've hiked in Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, if you've ventured into a slot canyon, you have visited public lands. If you've shot guns at Lake Mountain, if you've biked in Dead Horse Point, if you've been to one of Utah's 5 national parks, you've visited and benefited from public lands. Before Europeans pushed into the area, the earliest recorded inhabitants of Utah were the ancient Puebloan, Fremont, then later Ute, Paiute, Goshute, Shoshone, and Navajo. As Western Europe colonized Western America and pushed Native Americans onto reservations, claims were made on some of the lands in Utah.
The western states emerged from lands that the federal government acquired through a combination of wars, the U.S.-Mexican War, for example, purchases, and treaties. The state of Utah emerged out of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo between the United States and Mexico, signed in 1848, that transferred ownership of lands that are now the state of Utah from Mexico to the United States.
Most American teenagers could tell you about the famous Louisiana Purchase, the deal that doubled the size of the United States. But fewer textbooks cover the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The signing of this treaty ended the war between the United States and Mexico and awarded the United States land equal to 1/3 of Mexico's total territory, which later became California and the southwestern United States. A few decades later, in the wake of burgeoning populations spurned by the concept of manifest destiny, Utah became a state on January 4th, 1896.
Upon statehood, the state of Utah acquired, through the Utah Statehood Enabling Act, approximately 7.5 million acres of land that had previously been owned by the federal government. The federal government retained the remainder of the lands, and those were available for disposal through laws like the Homesteading Act and a variety of similar laws that followed.
But even with the land giveaways, much of the land remained unclaimed.
Nearly 2/3 of the state of Utah went unclaimed. It's worth noting that the state, through the original statehood grants of public land and the settlement patterns that transferred land into private ownership, give the state nearly 14 million acres in private ownership. That's equivalent to the size of Maryland and Massachusetts.
Even with this grand giveaway, the United States government still had millions of unclaimed acres. Swaths of land larger than some European countries were left empty and unwanted. This historical development is evident in other Western states. In 11 Western states, 47% of the land is federally owned. In the other 29 states, the federal government owns only 4%.
Stay tuned, because when we come right back, we'll be hearing from State Senator Jim Dubakis about the recent fights in the state legislature. UTopia, brought to you in part by Grand Staircase Escalante Partners, committed to preserving and protecting the vast landscape of Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. Join the cause at gsenm.org.
Due to the graphic nature of this program, parental discretion is advised. Learn a little local history while having the crap scared out of you. Park City Ghost Tours, the scariest adventure in Park City. 75-minute historic walking tours on Main Street, Park City. Call 435-615-7673 or visit parkcityghosttours.com.
A life entertaining tourists is no life for a wild animal. Whether taken from the wild or bred in captivity, they are beaten and forced to endure cruel training. Animals need you to stand up for them. Help World Animal Protection stop their abuse and exploitation. Together, we can change the minds of tourists, the travel industry, and governments. Together, we can keep wild animals in the wild where they belong. Wild animals are not entertainers. Stand up for wildlife now. Visit standupforwildlife.org.
Shopping for a new car? Welcome to Mark Miller Subaru's Express Car Buying. With our exclusive Express store, you can search all cars in our inventory or configure your dream Subaru and we'll find it for you. Get our best pricing up front with Mark Miller Subaru's exclusive Promise Price program. Select payment options for cash, finance, or lease transactions. Get an instant cash offer for your trade-in. No need to visit the dealership. Research and select recommended service and protection plans. Have a question? No problem. Your concierge will be there for you every step of the way. Complete the entire transaction from the comfort of your home in a matter of minutes. Pick up your new Subaru at Mark Miller Subaru or have it delivered to you. Your new car will be prepped and ready to go. In and out in less than 30 minutes. Instant pricing and express checkout. Enjoy Promise Price 2.0. Express car buying exclusively at Mark Miller Subaru. During the Subaru A Lot to Love event. Now open 24/7 at mmsubaru.com.
Welcome back, and now more. The fight over public land, a history.
In 11 western states, 47% of the land is federally owned. In the other 29 states, the federal government owns only 4%. In 1976, the federal government set up the program Payments in Lieu of Taxes, or PILT, which enabled federal payments to local governments that help offset losses in property taxes due to non-taxable federal lands within their boundaries.
PILT, Payments in Lieu of Taxes, is the great secret of the Utah legislature and of the state. This is millions and millions of dollars that the federal government pays the state because they are a landowner in the state of Utah, and the checks just pile in. And you never hear a Utah legislator say, "Thank you, federal government, for the PILT payments." They act like it isn't even there. It's there, it's millions of dollars.
With the PILT program, federal dollars flow locally. Without federal lands, no PILT money. Less federal lands means less PILT income. Currently, the cost of managing the lands falls on the federal government, so the state gets all the rewards and none of the responsibilities associated with ownership and management.
If we had a Washington, D.C. delegation that cared about public lands, really cared about rural Utah, they would stop arguing, "Give us back our land," and they would be saying, "Make the PILT money equal 2017 and 2018 and 2019 prices." If we had a bill that said, just like every other landowner, the federal government ought to be paying their fair share in taxes, at least what agricultural interests pay, then it would be hundreds of millions of dollars more to the state. But our legislature refuses to say increase the PILT money because somehow that hurts them ideologically. That's a big mistake.
In the mid-1970s, for the first time ever, the Bureau of Land Management commissioned studies to determine the carrying capacity of rangeland in the West. The review resulted in calls for reductions in herd size. Hostilities flared after Congress passed the Federal Land Policy and Management Act in 1976. This act spelled out new guidelines for federal lands that aimed to create a balance between extraction, conservation, and recreation. In other words, the land became multi-use. Traditionally, optimizing extractive industries like mining, timber, and drilling was the mandate guiding the federal land managers. That all changed in 1976.
The federal laws that shape the management of these lands compel these agencies to look at multiple use and to value wildlife and water resources and cultural resources on an equal playing field with things like mineral and cattle and things like that. And so they don't like that. They don't like that balancing. They want to prioritize extraction and how do we make money, and it's all just, it's hard not to view it as a very short-sighted scheme that we will all be so much poorer if the state of Utah or local officials have their say over these lands.
But it wasn't just the Federal Land Policy and Management Act that turned the tide nationwide. There was a growing discontent in the United States with the way that corporations and industry were polluting the environment. A great man once said, "The best way to protect wilderness areas is to enact legislation." And in this case, he was right again.
In the 60s and 70s, you had a suite of environmental laws. I think there was more of an awakening in the United States writ large that we were not, we as a country, federal government was not doing right by the environment and by how the federal government was going to manage federal public lands and resources. So you saw a whole host of laws from the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act to Federal Land Policy Management Act, Endangered Species Act, National Environmental Policy Act, and this gave environmental advocates new tools to weigh in on how federal agencies were managing these lands.
When we come back, the conclusion to our story, the fight over public lands.
I see ICOS being a great tool. It increases language production and also meets a lot of our kindergarten objectives behind math and science and language arts and even social studies. It's meeting science objectives because we're talking about parts of a whole and understanding how things are connected to make a whole. It meets math objectives because we're counting and we're building and we're using the spatial awareness. It meets language arts objectives because of all of the language that it inspires. They're using questions that involve colors and shapes and things that we teach in here, and they don't realize that they're learning along the way. I absolutely recommend it, and I think that kids of all ages would enjoy working with this, and you can use it in so many different ways. They love ICOS.
In the heart of an extraordinary landscape, there exists an oasis of calm, comfort, and luxury. Boulder Mountain Lodge. Our mission at Boulder Mountain Lodge is to introduce guests to the unparalleled natural wonders of Boulder Escalante region, while providing a lodging experience as memorable as the surrounding landscape. And the Boulder Mountain Lodge is home to the world-famous Hell's Backbone Grill, where the food is heavenly. Call or book online today.
Save the Bears. Sign the petition. Go to helpbears.org. That's helpbears.org.
UTopia, brought to you in part by Echo Shoes, where fashion meets comfort. Echo Shoes, cool in every detail. And now the conclusion to our story. Here's Sean King.
They believe that they have the right to interfere with local government, to interfere with the management of those lands. They believe they belong to them. It's selfishness.
Since the 1970s, there have been numerous attempts, entirely by Utah Republicans in the state and federal legislatures, to fight the federal government on the issue. Legislation such as the Transfer of Public Lands Act from Ken Ivory, the Disposal of Excess Federal Lands Act from Jason Chaffetz, the Public Lands Initiative from Robert Bishop, Getting technical for a moment, what does public lands legal expert Bob Keeter say about this newest attempt to wrangle public lands away from federal control?
The state of Utah has asserted a legal claim that would force the federal government either to transfer the federal lands here in the state of Utah to the state or alternatively to dispose of those lands. That claim is predicated upon some language in the Utah Statehood Enabling Act. However, that act makes quite clear that the state, upon statehood, disclaimed any claim of title or ownership to the federal public lands that the government continued to retain in the state upon statehood. It's hard to see how a court could ignore what are referred to as the disclaimer clauses in the Utah Enabling Act.
A common misunderstanding concerning rancher Cliven Bundy's refusal to pay grazing fees is his belief the land once belonged to Nevada. This is the same argument and belief system as many Utah politicians utilize to justify costly legislation seeking appropriation of public lands for state control. But there is a problem with this belief.
The land that the state of Utah asserts a claim of ownership of simply wasn't in the state's hands ever.
There seems to be a disconnect between what people believe and what is actually true. In many cases, alternative facts have replaced reality. For instance, with Cliven Bundy's grazing fees. Fees he agreed upon when he signed contracts with the BLM to graze his cattle on public lands. Fees that were 5 to 10 times less than what is charged on state-owned and private land, and fees he failed to pay as he sold his cattle for profit. Federal livestock grazing fee payments go into the general federal treasury and are a benefit to all the people of the United States. It's one of the benefits that comes from our common ownership of the lands, along with having access to pristine wilderness areas that are so important for wildlife and for our future.
It's easy when you talk about this issue, I think, to lose sight of the fact that these are federal lands managed on behalf of all Americans, and that somebody in Seattle or Salt Lake City or Montgomery, Alabama has as much claim to how these lands are managed and protected as somebody who lives in, say, Monticello, Utah, in San Juan County.
Every few years, the fight over state control of public lands ebbs and flows with new waves of state legislature and federal pawns in the hands of extraction advocates mixed in with some free grazers.
Living here in the West, I think one of the most important things for us is to recognize the extraordinary resource that the federal public lands represent. It provides economic return for our state, for our local communities, but it also provides open space, recreational opportunities, and spiritual renewal for our citizens. And this is really a treasure for us as a state, as a nation, to have this type of common publicly owned land available for all citizens to take advantage of. You simply don't find this elsewhere in the world.
Unfortunately, this is a fight that will continue into the near future.
Like a Cub Scout who goes camping, your obligation is to leave it cleaner and better after you've camped. Our legislature never has taken to heart that responsibility. Some of this land, it took 300 million years to present itself, and in an afternoon, they can wipe it out. The state can't wait to get its hands on this land and auction it off. It's a degradation of our most important responsibility.
Those who want to protect federal land need to speak up. Those who prefer petroglyphs to petroleum need to make their voices heard. Those who sit back and watch as wilderness is culled become complicit.
Now that's what I call American exceptionalism. Public lands are an equalizer, whether you're rich or poor, old or young, brown or white. All Americans are equal owners of these lands. Today we focus mostly on the legal and the historical aspects of federally managed public lands, important issues when combating efforts to transfer control. But ultimately, it's about protecting these landscapes from encroaching development and short-sighted capitalists. These places belong to all Americans living today and in the future. And a reminder, just in case you've missed any previous episodes, visit us online at utopiatvseries.com. And remember, don't be a couch doorsman. Get out and enjoy our spectacular Utopia.
Every time you purchase a fishing license or register your boat, you're helping to preserve our nation's coastlines, lakes, rivers, and streams, protecting memories for generations to come. Learn how your participation in boating and fishing can help the environment at takemefishing.org/conservation.
Shopping for a new car? Welcome to Mark Miller Subaru's Express Car Buying. With our exclusive Express store, you can search all cars in our inventory or configure your dream Subaru and we'll find it for you. Get our best pricing up front with Mark Miller Subaru's exclusive Promise Price program. Select payment options for cash, finance, or lease transactions. Get an instant cash offer for your trade-in. No need to visit the dealership. Research and select recommended service and protection plans. Have a question? No problem. Your concierge will be there for you every step of the way. Complete the entire transaction from the comfort of your home in a matter of minutes. Pick up your new Subaru at Mark Miller Subaru or have it delivered to you. Your new car will be prepped and ready to go. In and out in less than 30 minutes. Instant pricing and express checkout. Enjoy Promise Price 2.0. Express car buying exclusively at Mark Miller Subaru. Now open 24/7. More at mmsubaru.com.